There are families that drift quietly through history, leaving barely a trace. And then there are families that seem to crash straight through it, leaving chaos and fascination in equal measure. The Mitfords were very much the second kind. 6 sisters, born to one eccentric English aristocratic family in the early years of the 20th century. 6 young women who grew up in the same house, shared the same upbringing, breathed the same country air, and yet they scattered themselves across almost every extreme that the century had to offer. One became a fascist, one became a communist, one married a Nazi, one ran off to a war zone at 17, one became one of the most celebrated writers of her generation, and one retreated from the world almost entirely. The Mitford story is not a comfortable one. It is strange, sometimes painful, and often deeply difficult to reckon with. But it is one of the most extraordinary stories that 20th century Britain produced. This is where it begins. The man at the center of it all was David Freeman-Mitford, who became the 2nd Baron Redesdale in 1916. He was not what you might call a typical English lord. He had little patience for books, almost no interest in polite conversation, and a volcanic temper that his children would remember for the rest of their lives. David Redesdale had spent time in Burma as a young man. He had worked in a gold mine in Canada. He had fought in the First World War and been badly wounded, losing a lung. By the time he settled into domestic life, he was restless in the way that only men of action become when the action stops. His wife was Sydney Bowles, known to the family as Move. She was cool where David was hot. Reserved where he was explosive, she believed in a great many unusual things, including the idea that sugar was a poison and that children should largely be left to find their own way. She did not fuss, she did not cosset. She observed her children with a kind of calm detachment that some of them found comforting and others found rather unnerving. Together, David and Sydney had 7 children, 1 son, Tom, born in 1909, and 6 daughters, born between 1904 and 1920. Nancy came first, then Pamela, then Tom, the only boy, then Diana, then Unity, then Jessica, then Deborah, the youngest, born in 1920. The family moved around during the early years, but eventually settled at a house in the Cotswolds called Asthall Manor, and later at Swinbrook House in Oxfordshire. The house at Swinbrook was David's creation, a rather cold and oddly proportioned place that the children largely hated. Their upbringing was, by any modern measure, extremely peculiar. The girls were not sent to school. David Redesdale had a deep suspicion of formal education, particularly for girls. He believed it filled their heads with nonsense. The girls were taught at home by a series of governesses, but the quality of that teaching was inconsistent at best. What they learned, they largely learned themselves, through reading whatever they could get their hands on. Their world was the country house, the estate, the local village, and each other. They invented a private language they called Budledge. They gave each other nicknames that stuck for life. They formed alliances and rivalries that would shape everything that came after. Nancy, the eldest, was sharp and witty and slightly cruel in the way eldest children sometimes are. She read voraciously and developed a satirical eye that she would eventually turn on her own family with devastating effect. Pamela, the second daughter, was the quiet one, the one the others tended to overlook. She loved animals and the countryside and had a practical, grounded nature that stood at some distance from the dramas playing out around her. Diana was considered the great beauty of the family. Photographs from her youth bear this out. She was striking in a way that opened doors, and she knew it. Unity was strange from childhood. Large, intense, capable of sudden rages and sudden strange devotions. She collected unusual things. She made uncomfortable observations. Even as a small child, she seemed to exist at a slight angle to the world around her. Jessica was the rebel from the start, furious and funny and determined to escape. She kept a running away account, a small pot of money she saved for the day she would finally leave. And Deborah, the youngest, grew up watching all of this unfold around her. She was the one who would, in the end, outlast them all. The 1930s arrived, and with them, everything changed. Britain in the early part of that decade was a country in trouble. The Great Depression had bitten hard. Unemployment was high. There was a restlessness in the air, a sense that the old order was crumbling and something new was coming, though no one was quite sure what shape it would take. It was into this atmosphere that the Mitford girls began to make their way into the world. Nancy had already published her first novel by this point. She was moving in London's social circles, writing sharp, witty pieces, observing everyone around her. She would marry in 1933 a man called Peter Rodd, who was charming and almost entirely useless. The marriage was not a happy one, and it dragged on for years in a state of quiet mutual disappointment. But it was Diana and Unity whose choices would bring the most serious consequences. Diana had made what seemed at first like a brilliant marriage. In 1929, at the age of 19, she married Brian Guinness, heir to the brewing fortune. He was wealthy, kind, and devoted to her. They had 2 sons. They moved in the most glamorous circles of London society. It looked, from the outside, like everything a young aristocratic woman could want. And then she met Oswald Mosley. Oswald Mosley was the most dangerous man in Britain, or so many people would come to believe. He had been a Conservative MP, then a Labour minister, then had broken away to form his own party. By the early 1930s, he had founded the British Union of Fascists, and he was drawing enormous crowds to his rallies. Diana was captivated. She left Brian Guinness for Mosley, leaving behind her sons, her comfortable life, her reputation. She did it fully knowing what it meant. Mosley was already married, and not the sort of man to let that trouble him greatly. Diana became his mistress, then eventually, in 1936, his wife. They married in secret, in Berlin, at the home of Joseph Goebbels. Adolf Hitler was among the guests. The British establishment was appalled. Diana's own father refused to speak to her for years. Her mother took a different view, which was to largely pretend nothing unusual was happening. Diana herself never wavered. Not then, not later, not at any point in her extremely long life. She believed in what Mosley was doing. She admired Hitler, whom she had met several times, and found charming and impressive.
Lady Mosley, your family has been described as a savage tribe. Now, do you concede that title?
We may have seemed a savage tribe to outsiders, I suppose.
But not to you?
No.
Looking back at them, do you think of yourselves as a savage tribe?
I don't. I think we were a tribe.
In your book,
She held these views with a serenity that many people found more disturbing than anger would have been. If Diana's story was one of calculated choices, Unity's was something closer to an obsession. Unity Mitford became fixated on Adolf Hitler in the early 1930s with an intensity that went beyond politics. She wanted to meet him. She decided she would meet him. She moved to Munich in 1933. She learned German. She began attending the same restaurants where Hitler was known to eat, sitting at a table near his, hoping to catch his eye. And then one day he sent a message over, inviting her to join him. From that point on, Unity Mitford became part of Hitler's inner circle. She was photographed with him, she attended Nazi rallies, she met Goebbels, Himmler, Eva Braun. She wrote letters home describing her new life with an enthusiasm that chilled even those who had known her since childhood. Her father, Lord Redesdale, was at first swept along by the association. He attended a Nuremberg rally himself in 1937 and was photographed in the company of senior Nazis. He came back a briefly enthusiastic supporter of the German leadership. It did not last, but the photographs remained. Unity's behavior was a source of enormous distress to Jessica, who was moving in exactly the opposite political direction at exactly the same time. Jessica had discovered communism. She had read Marx, joined left-wing groups, and fallen in love with a young man called Esmond Romilly, who was Winston Churchill's nephew and a committed socialist who had run away from school to fight in the Spanish Civil War. When Jessica was 18, she and Esmond ran away together. They fled to Spain, where the Civil War was still being fought. Jessica's parents were frantic. They sent a naval destroyer to bring her home. She refused to come. Lord Redesdale wrote to Winston Churchill asking for help in retrieving his daughter. Churchill, who had his own problems with his nephew Esmond, was not particularly sympathetic. Jessica and Esmond eventually married. They moved to America, and for a brief time, they were happy. Back in England, the news coming out of Germany was growing darker by the month. The British government was still trying to manage its relationship with Hitler. There were people in influential circles who believed that accommodation was possible, that war could be avoided, that the Nazi regime might moderate itself. Diana Mosley and Unity Mitford were part of a wider world of British aristocrats and politicians who looked toward Germany with something other than alarm. This world would collapse completely in the first days of September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany. For Unity, the declaration was catastrophic in a way that went beyond politics. She was in Munich when war was announced. She had spent years building her entire life around her association with Hitler and the Nazi movement. Now, Britain and Germany were enemies. She could not go home. She could not stay. On the day war was declared, Unity Mitford walked into the English garden in Munich and shot herself in the head with a small pistol that Hitler had given her as a gift. She did not die immediately. The bullet lodged in her brain but did not kill her. Hitler paid for her medical care. He arranged for her to be transported, eventually, back to Britain through neutral Switzerland. She arrived home in January 1940, a different person. The Unity who came back was not the Unity who had left. The bullet had done something to her mind that could not be undone. She was childlike at times, confused, prone to sudden weeping. She had headaches that never entirely went away. She needed almost constant care. She would live for another 8 years, in a state somewhere between the person she had been and something more reduced. She died in 1948, in Scotland, from meningitis connected to the old wound in her head. Diana's story took a different turn in the war years, but no less severe. When war broke out, Oswald Mosley continued to campaign against it. He argued that Britain had no business fighting Germany, that the war was unnecessary, that a negotiated peace was possible. The British government, perhaps predictably, had very little patience for this. In May 1940, under Defense Regulation 18B, which allowed the detention of persons believed to be a threat to national security, both Oswald Mosley and Diana Mitford were arrested and imprisoned. Diana was taken from her home and held in Holloway Prison. She and Mosley were eventually allowed to be imprisoned together, given a small house within the prison grounds. They had their children brought to visit. Diana later described this period in her memoirs with a remarkable equanimity that again struck readers as somewhere between dignified and unsettling. They were released in 1943 on grounds of Mosley's declining health. The public reaction was furious. There were protests outside their home. Winston Churchill, who was by this point Prime Minister, faced questions in Parliament about why they had been freed. The family were moved around for their own safety. They eventually settled at a house in Oxfordshire near Swinbrook. They were not popular. They were watched. They were not charged with any crime, but the association with fascism sat over Diana for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Jessica's war was being lived on a very different continent. She and Esmond were in America when war broke out. Esmond had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. In November 1941, his plane was lost on a mission over the North Sea. He was 23 years old. His body was never found. Jessica was 24, widowed, with a small daughter. She was alone in a foreign country. She did not go home. She stayed in America. She found work. She found new friends in left-wing circles. And eventually she fell in love again with an American civil rights lawyer named Robert Truhaft. They married in 1943. Jessica converted to Judaism. She joined the Communist Party. She and Robert settled in Oakland, California, and threw themselves into civil rights work, representing clients that no one else would touch, fighting cases in a South that was still rigidly segregated. This was not the life that anyone who knew the Mitford family in the 1930s could possibly have predicted for one of their daughters. Nancy, watching all of this unfold from England, was doing what she had always done. She was writing. The war years brought her to London, where she worked in a bookshop called Hayward Hill in Curzon Street, a shop that became a gathering point for literary London during the Blitz. She served customers, organized stock, and wrote in whatever time she could find. In 1945, she published the novel that would make her famous. The Pursuit of Love drew directly on her family for its material. The tyrannical father, Lord Alconley, was unmistakably David Redesdale. The eccentric household, the strange upbringing, the girls hunting for escape. It was funny and affectionate, and at the same time, absolutely merciless. It was a huge success. It made Nancy financially independent for the first time in her life, and it established her voice as one of the great satirical voices of post-war Britain. She wrote several more novels. Cold Comfort Farm came later. Pigeon Pie, The Blessing. She also wrote popular biographies of Madame de Pompadour and Louis XIV, but her personal life remained complicated. During the war, she had fallen deeply in love with a free French officer named Gaston Palevsky. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly faithful man. He charmed women easily, and he had no interest in being tied down. Nancy knew this. She loved him anyway, with a devotion that lasted for the rest of her life. She moved to Paris in 1946 to be near him. She lived in France for the rest of her days, in an apartment on the Rue Monsieur, waiting for Palevsky to make up his mind about her, translating her longing into sharp, funny prose. Palevsky eventually married someone else. Nancy was devastated. She wrote about it to her sisters. She wrote about it to her friends. She turned the pain into wit, the way she had always done. She was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1969. She died in 1973, at the age of 68, after 4 years of considerable suffering. The question that follows the Mitford story everywhere is this: how did it happen? How did 6 sisters, raised in the same house by the same parents, end up at such extremes? The isolation of Swinbrook, the lack of formal schooling, the absence of moderating influences from outside the family. The girls formed their characters largely from books and from each other. And when they encountered ideas in the outside world, they tended to encounter them with the full force of people who had never been taught to hold back. Nancy turned her intelligence into satire. Pamela turned hers toward animals and farming, and a quiet country life that stood entirely apart from the dramas of her sisters. Diana turned hers toward politics and attachment, a combination that proved combustible. Unity turned hers toward Hitler, with consequences that were catastrophic. Jessica turned hers toward justice, spending decades fighting for people on the margins. And Deborah, the youngest, turned hers toward something that might seem the most ordinary of all, but which turned out to require extraordinary gifts. Deborah Mitford married Andrew Cavendish in 1941. Andrew was the second son of the Duke of Devonshire, which meant that at the time of their marriage, there was no expectation he would ever inherit the title. Then, in 1944, Andrew's older brother Billy was killed in the war, and suddenly, Andrew was heir to one of the grandest estates in England. He became the 11th Duke of Devonshire in 1950. The family seat was Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, one of the greatest country houses in Britain. It was also, at the time of inheritance, something close to a financial disaster. The death duties on the estate were so enormous that the family spent 17 years paying them off. Land was sold. Art was sold. The family moved out of Chatsworth for several years while they worked out whether it was even possible to keep it. Deborah, now Duchess of Devonshire, decided it was. She threw herself into the work of saving Chatsworth, with an energy and business intelligence that surprised everyone who had assumed she was merely decorative. She opened the house to the public. She developed the farm shop. She brought in new commercial ventures. She wrote books about Chatsworth, books that sold in large numbers and brought fresh visitors to the estate. Under her management, Chatsworth was transformed from a crumbling burden into a thriving enterprise. The house was restored, the gardens were maintained, the collections were catalogued. She became, in her own way, the most practically successful of the sisters. She outlived all of them. Pamela died in 1994. Jessica died in 1996. Diana died in 2003. Nancy and Unity had gone decades earlier. Andrew, her husband, died in 2004. Deborah went on alone, writing, farming, opening fates, answering letters from strangers who were interested in her family. She died in 2014, at the age of 94. The question of Diana never goes away. She lived until 2003, dying in Paris at the age of 93. She had spent decades giving interviews in which she defended her views, defended Mosley, expressed her continued admiration for Hitler, and showed no signs of believing she had anything to apologize for. These interviews became occasions of considerable public controversy. How does one speak to a woman who attended Hitler's private functions and found them delightful? How does one sit across from someone who regards one of the worst mass murderers in history as a charming and underestimated man? Diana's answer to this question was essentially to decline to engage with it. She had seen what she had seen. She had believed what she had believed. She was not going to pretend otherwise for the comfort of an audience that had not been there. This position attracted both fierce condemnation and, from a certain kind of contrarian, a grudging respect for its consistency. Whether consistency of belief is admirable when the belief in question is that thoroughly documented, that thoroughly known to have led to systematic mass murder, is a question that each reader must answer for themselves. What is clear is that Diana's choices placed a shadow over the entire family that never fully lifted. Her sisters dealt with it in different ways. Jessica, by that point, living in California and having spent decades fighting for civil rights, found the whole business impossible to discuss without fury. Nancy had spent years gently mocking Diana's politics in private letters while maintaining the surface warmth of family relations. Deborah loved her sister and found ways to separate the person from the politics that others found impossible to replicate. Jessica's story in the American years runs in fascinating counterpoint to Diana's, where Diana sat at dinners with the German leadership and found it agreeable. Jessica sat at trial tables with black defendants in Alabama and Arkansas and found the whole machinery of American racial injustice as straightforward and evil as anything she had seen described from Europe. She and Robert Treuhaft became known as two of the most effective civil rights lawyers in Northern California. They took cases that no one else would take. They represented union members, Communist Party members, people on the wrong side of McCarthyite America. Jessica was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. She refused to answer questions about her party membership. She named no one. She was threatened and harassed and continued doing exactly what she had been doing. She left the Communist Party in the late 1950s, in the aftermath of Khrushchev's speech revealing the full scale of Stalin's crimes. The speech shook many on the Western left, and Jessica was among those who could no longer maintain the official position. She left the party, but she did not move rightward. Her politics remained those of a person who believed that the powerful had very little interest in sharing anything with the powerless, and that the work of pushing back against that was worth doing. In 1963, she published The American Way of Death, an investigation into the funeral industry in the United States. She had become interested in the subject after the death of a friend, and what she found appalled her. The funeral industry, she documented, exploited the grief of bereaved families on an industrial scale, selling unnecessary services at enormous profit, preying on people at their most vulnerable. The book was a sensation. It was funny and angry and extremely well-researched. It changed the industry. Funeral reform legislation followed in its wake. It established Jessica as one of the great investigative journalists of her generation. She wrote several more books over the following decades. A Kind and Just Parent, The Trial of Dr. Spock, Poison Penmanship. Her final book, The American Way of Birth, appeared in 1992. She died of cancer in 1996, at the age of 78. It is worth pausing for a moment on Pamela. The second sister tends to get overlooked in any account of the Mitfords, and she was overlooked in life as well. She was not glamorous in the way Diana was. She was not funny in the way Nancy was. She was not politically dramatic in the way Unity, Jessica, and Diana were. She was kind and practical, and loved her dogs, and her chickens, and her garden. She married a physicist named Derek Jackson in 1936. Jackson was a brilliant, eccentric man who had several other wives after Pamela and a gift for causing chaos. The marriage ended in 1951. Pamela never remarried. She settled in Switzerland for a period, then returned to England. She lived quietly, growing vegetables, keeping animals, visiting her sisters. When people asked what Pamela was like, those who knew her tended to say warm, reliable, sensible. Words that can sound like faint praise, but that, set against the background of her family, begin to look rather more like achieved states. She died in 1994, at the age of 85. The letters are part of what makes the Mitford story so fully visible to us. The sisters wrote to each other constantly, across decades and continents and political chasms that ought to have made correspondence impossible. These letters were saved, and the best of them were eventually published. Reading them is a strange experience. You find Diana writing to Nancy with warmth and teasing affection, and Nancy writing back in kind, and it is easy, briefly, to forget what Diana believed and who she had associated herself with and why. The warmth is real. The sisterly love is real. And then you turn a page, and the context comes back, and you are reminded that love, even strong love, does not settle moral questions. You find Jessica writing to Deborah from Oakland, describing her life in terms that are comic and self-deprecating, the difficulties of left-wing politics, the dreariness of party meetings, the absurdity of being a Mitford in California. And Deborah writing back from Chatsworth about the sheep and the visitors, and the state of the roof, the two of them at opposite ends of every political spectrum, maintained one of the warmer correspondences in the family. They found in each other a kind of relief from the weight of their own positions. What remains of the Mitford story after all the politics and the scandals and the long lives fully lived? The books, first of all. Nancy's novels remain in print and are still read with pleasure. The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate are among the sharpest, funniest accounts of English upper-class life that the 20th century produced. They are books that make you laugh and then make you feel slightly guilty for laughing because the satire cuts with real precision. Jessica's books remain in print as well. The American Way of Death is still consulted by people who want to understand the American funeral industry, and the journalism still stands as a model of engaged, committed writing in the service of genuine change. Deborah's books about Chatsworth are read by everyone who visits the house, and the house itself, still open to the public, still run as she shaped it, is her most lasting monument. Diana left memoirs. They are read, but cautiously, and usually in the company of other accounts that provide the context she tended to leave out. The story also left behind a word. In the 1950s, Nancy Mitford and a professor named Alan Ross became involved in a public discussion about the language habits of the English upper classes. The exchange led to Nancy writing an essay about what she called you and non-you, the linguistic markers that separated upper-class English from the aspiring middle class. It caused an enormous commotion. People argued about it in newspapers, at dinner parties, in letters to the editor. The idea that vocabulary betrayed class was not a new one, but Nancy had articulated it with such precision and such amusement that it became a cultural movement. The Mitfords had spent their whole lives performing Englishness of a particular kind. The country house, the aristocratic eccentricity, the deliberate disdain for convention. Nancy turned even that into material. There is something about the Mitford story that resists easy summary. It would be satisfying if the lesson was clear. If we could say that the family's unusual upbringing led predictably to unusual outcomes, and leave it at that. If we could say that the isolation of Swinbrook produced political extremists, that the lack of education produced dangerous credulity, that the emotional distance of their parents produced daughters who attached themselves to ideas rather than to people. There is something in all of that. The girls were, in a real sense, unprotected. They encountered the ideas of the 1930s, the fascism and the communism and the class conflicts and the nationalism, without the kind of intellectual scaffolding that a more conventional education might have provided. They were passionate, and they were impulsive, and they were inclined to believe that commitment was a virtue in itself, regardless of what was being committed to. And yet, Pamela built a quiet, decent life. Deborah built something extraordinary from the ruins of an estate. Nancy transformed private pain into public art. Jessica spent decades fighting for people who had no one else fighting for them. The same family produced all of these outcomes. The same house, the same parents, the same Swinbrook winters, the same bedrooms and arguments, and long country walks. What the Mitford story tells us, perhaps, is something about the limits of explanation. We want families to produce consistent results. We want upbringings to predict outcomes. We want to be able to look at a set of circumstances and say, yes, this is why it went the way it did. The Mitfords resist that entirely. They went every possible way, and they went all the way, whatever direction they chose. That is what makes them so hard to forget. Always applied to everything. She had watched 6 daughters become 6 different people, and she had, by most accounts, loved them all in her own distant way. Whether that was enough is a question her children answered differently. The house at Swinbrook still stands. The church nearby holds the graves of several family members, including Unity, whose grave is visited by strangers who are still, all these decades on, curious about her. Chatsworth still draws hundreds of thousands of visitors a year, shaped by the work of the woman who was once the youngest Mitford sister, the one who grew up watching everyone else make the news. And in bookshops and libraries, on shelves in houses across Britain and America, the books that the sisters wrote continue to be found by new readers who did not know, when they picked them up, what family they were getting. That is perhaps what holds the Mitford story together in the end. Not the politics as loud as they were, not the scandals as lasting as their shadows proved to be, the books, the letters, the evidence of 6 minds fully working in 6 entirely different directions across a century that asked more of ordinary people than any century before it. They were not ordinary people, of course. That was always part of the problem and part of the fascination. But they were people, and the story of how they lived, taken whole, in all its difficulty and its absurdity and its pain, remains one of the most fully human stories that England, in all its strange history, has managed to produce.